The grand ballroom of the Obsidian Tower smelled of power. It was a potent perfume of chilled champagne, imported orchids, and the quiet, crisp aroma of $100 bills changing hands in the form of silent agreements and leveraged futures. For 23-year-old Alara Vance, shuffling on tired feet that had been captive in cheap but mandatory heels for 9 hours, it mostly smelled like the end of a rope. Each polite murmur and burst of manufactured laughter was a second slipping away from the time she needed to study, to sleep, to be anything other than a ghost in a black bistro apron. Then he held court at the center of the room, a planet with his own gravitational pull, Marcus Thorne, a man whose chiseled face was a fixture on the covers of Forbes and Architectural Digest, a real estate titan who hadn't just built skyscrapers, but had sculpted the city's very skyline in his own image. Tonight was in his honor, a gala celebrating the 10th anniversary of this very building, the Obsidian Tower, his crowning achievement. Ilara's job was simple: be invisible, keep the champagne flutes full, and never ever make eye contact with the gods of the city. She was circling the perimeter of Thorne's group, a silver tray of canapes held aloft, when he decided to perform for his audience. With a flourish, he gestured to a young, eager reporter from the Metropolitan Journal. "People forget the soul of a building," Thorne declared, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that commanded attention. "They see the steel and glass, but they don't see the spark, the genesis. I've kept it all these years." He produced a slim, leather-bound portfolio from his aide. From it, he slid a single sheet of drafting paper, now yellowed and preserved in a plastic sleeve. It was a concept sketch of the Obsidian Tower, but rendered with a raw, breathtaking genius. It wasn't a cold blueprint. It was a vision, drawn in charcoal and ink, of a skyscraper that didn't just pierce the clouds but seemed to dance with them. And in that instant, as the reporter's cameras flashed, Ilara's universe ground to a halt. The silver tray wobbled in her hand, because there, in the bottom right-hand corner, was a signature. It wasn't a sterile, printed name. It was a fluid, passionate scrawl, a personal emblem she knew better than her own reflection. An elegant, sweeping E followed by a sharp, decisive V. The signature of a man she hadn't seen in 15 years. The signature of her father, Elias Vance. The Obsidian Tower wasn't just a building. It was a monument to Marcus Thorne's ego. And Alara Vance was just another cog in the machine that kept it running. For 2 years, she had navigated its labyrinthine service corridors, memorized the dinner orders of venture capitalists, and perfected the art of the deferential nod. Her life had become a meticulously controlled orbit of service and survival. Her own dreams of becoming an architect, the very dreams her father had nurtured in her, tucked away like old photographs. Tonight, her section included the man of the hour himself. Marcus Thorne radiated an aura of casual omnipotence, the kind that comes from a lifetime of having the world bend to his will. His suit was tailored with surgical precision, his silver hair was perfect, and his smile never quite reached the cold, calculating depths of his eyes. He addressed his circle of admirers, which included the city's mayor and several bank presidents, but his words seemed aimed at the history books. "The key," Thorne was saying, tapping a manicured finger on the glass protecting the sketch, "was the cantilevered atrium. Everyone said it was impossible, a structural nightmare. But I knew. I saw it." Ilara stood frozen just beyond the circle, the tray of prosciutto-wrapped figs growing heavier by the second. Inside her, a storm was brewing, a tempest of grief, confusion, and a sudden, searing rage. She should have been designing buildings like this, not serving hors d'oeuvres in them. 2 years ago, she'd been the top student in her architecture program at the State University, her path a clear, sunlit road to success. Then the diagnosis came. Her mother, Laura, was diagnosed with a rare form of multiple sclerosis. The decline was aggressive. The scholarship covered Ilara's tuition, but it was a drop in the ocean compared to the crushing weight of medical bills, home modifications, and the specialized care her mother now required. So, Ilara made a choice. She put her degree on hold, trading the world of blueprints and scale models for the immediate reality of rent and prescriptions. She moved her mother into a more accessible ground floor apartment, took the best-paying service job she could find, and watched her own future shrink in the rearview mirror. Her father, Elias Vance, the gaping black hole in her life. He was a man who didn't just design buildings, he breathed life into them. He saw poetry in load-bearing walls and symphonies in skylines. He used to spread butcher paper on the living room floor and teach her about tensile strength and golden ratios as if they were magical spells. 15 years ago, when she was 8, he had vanished. One day he was there, his eyes alight with excitement, telling her he was on the brink of creating his masterpiece, a building that would scrape the stars. The next he was gone. His car was found at a rest stop 2 states away. A note left in their home spoke of crushing debts and a creative failure he couldn't overcome. The official story was that he had abandoned his family, a brilliant mind that had simply cracked under the pressure. The loss had hollowed out their lives. It had extinguished a light in her mother long before the illness began its work. For Ilara, it left a permanent, aching question mark, a fundamental disbelief in the narrative she'd been given. Her father was a dreamer, but he was also a fighter. He wasn't a man who would run from his problems. "Waitress," Thorne's voice, sharp as a shard of glass, sliced through her reverie. He gestured with his chin toward an empty flute on a nearby table. "Refills." He didn't look at her. He looked through her. "My apologies, sir," Ilara said, her voice a strained whisper. She moved to collect the glass, her hands trembling. Her training screamed at her to remain invisible, to retreat. But the sight of that sketch, of her father's stolen legacy being flaunted as a trophy, had ignited a fuse. As she reached for the glass, Thorne, basking in the glow of the reporter's adoration, held the sketch up to the light one last time. A flash of inspiration 20 years ago, he mused, and now a billion-dollar reality. The original vision for the Thorne Tower. He had even stolen the name, erasing Elias from the very stone and steel. The investors and city officials murmured their appreciation, but Ilara's eyes were locked on that signature. The E that looped like a suspension bridge cable, the V that jabbed downward like the sharpest spire. She had spent countless hours as a child trying to mimic it. The world seemed to slow down. The polite chatter of the gala faded to a dull roar. The weight of the empty champagne flute in her hand felt immense. Every doubt, every suspicion she had harbored for 15 years, coalesced into a single, blinding point of truth. A cold fury, purer and stronger than any emotion she had ever felt, washed away her exhaustion and her fear. Her voice when she spoke was not the meek, deferential tone of a waitress. It was quiet, but it was clear, and it carried the weight of a decade and a half of loss. "Sir," she said, her eyes locked on his, "that's my dad's signature." Marcus Thorne froze. For a brief, unguarded moment, his public mask of affable genius dissolved. What flashed across his face was not just surprise. It was the profound, primal shock of a long-buried crime suddenly unearthed. It was the panicked terror of a man watching a ghost walk through a locked door. The crystal champagne flute he was holding, halfway to his lips, slipped from his fingers. It didn't shatter on the plush carpet. It struck the edge of a marble side table with a sickening crack that echoed through the sudden silence. Shards of glass flew like tiny daggers. Champagne pooled on the polished stone, dripping onto the corner of the priceless sketch Thorne's aide was still holding. What did you just say?" Thorne stammered. His voice was a hoarse, strangled thing. His eyes, wide with a fear he couldn't conceal, darted from Ilara's face to the signature, then back again. The reporter, the mayor, the bankers, they all stared, their polite smiles frozen in confusion. The abrupt violence of the sound had shattered the gala's sophisticated facade. Heads were turning. Mr. Abernathy, the hotel's unflappable manager, was already making a beeline toward them, his expression one of deep concern. Ilara stood her ground. The cold certainty in her chest was an anchor in the swirling chaos. She pointed a hand that trembled only slightly. "That signature, Elias Vance. He was my father." Thorne's shock was rapidly being consumed by a desperate, cornered animal rage. He snatched the sketch from his aide, frantically wiping away a drop of champagne with the sleeve of his jacket. "This is absurd," he boomed, his voice regaining its power, but now laced with a brittle defensive edge. "Security, get this hysterical girl out of here." "I'm not hysterical." Alara shot back, her voice rising to meet his, cutting through the stunned murmurs of the crowd. I know his signature, and I know that design. He called it the Ethel. He used to tell me stories about it. It was his masterpiece. The name struck Thorne like a physical blow. His face went ashen, a sickly, chalky white beneath his carefully maintained tan. Project Ethel. It was a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 20 years, a name buried in the concrete foundations of his empire, a ghost he thought he had successfully exorcised forever. Mr. Abernathy arrived, his professional smile stretched painfully thin. Mr. Thorne, is there an issue? Ma'am, please, you're causing a disturbance. This waitress is harassing me, Thorne snarled, shoving the sketch back into its portfolio and snapping it shut. He took a step forward, towering over Alara, using his size and presence as a weapon. She's obviously unstable. I want her fired, now. Sir, I can assure you, Abernathy began, turning to Alara with pleading eyes. But Alara would not be silenced. 15 years of unanswered questions, of a grief she was told to accept without proof, were boiling over. He's the one who's lying, she declared, her voice ringing with a conviction that made people listen. She looked past Thorne to the bewildered faces of his guests. That building, the technology in its core, it was all my father's. He disappeared 15 years ago. This man built his entire career on a stolen dream and a lie. One of the bankers, a shrewd-looking woman named Mrs. Davies, glanced at Thorne, a flicker of analytical doubt in her eyes. The CEO's reaction was too visceral, too violent for a simple misunderstanding with a delusional employee. It was the reaction of a man with a secret to protect. That's enough, Thorne roared. He grabbed Alara's arm, his fingers digging into her bicep like claws. Get out! Get out of my sight! Alara wrenched her arm free, stumbling backward. You can't just erase people, Mr. Thorne. The truth doesn't work that way. Mr. Abernathy, seeing his billion-dollar client on the verge of a very public, very damaging implosion, made his choice. He stepped between them, his body a shield for Thorne. Miss Vance, you are terminated. Collect your belongings and leave the premises immediately. Security will escort you. Two hulking security guards in black suits, who had been moving in, now stood on either side of her. They didn't touch her, but their presence was a solid, immovable wall. The fight momentarily drained out of Alara, replaced by a cold, profound sense of injustice. She had spoken a truth that had been buried for half her life, and in response, the world had instantly closed ranks to protect the man in the $1,000 suit and cast her out. She locked eyes with Marcus Thorne one last time. The raw fear on his face was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian mask of controlled fury. His eyes delivered a silent, brutal promise. This isn't over. I will ruin you for this. As the guards walked her toward the staff exit, a path of silence parting before them through the whispering crowd, she could hear Thorne's voice, artificially smooth now, performing damage control. My sincerest apologies, everyone. A deeply disturbed former employee. Utterly tragic. Now where were we? Ah, yes, the zoning variances for the waterfront project. The heavy soundproof door to the kitchens swung shut behind her, cutting off his voice. Alara stood in the clattering, steam-filled chaos, her cheap apron suddenly feeling like a costume for a part she no longer played. She was fired, jobless. Her mother's next round of expensive medication was due in 5 days, but amidst the rising panic and the searing humiliation, a new feeling was taking root in the pit of her stomach. It was a cold, hard resolve. Thorne's reaction had not been one of an innocent man wrongly accused. It had been the explosive panic of a guilty man whose deepest secret had just been exposed. He wasn't just a thief. He was hiding something much, much darker. He hadn't just stolen her father's work. He knew what happened to him. Alara Vance, the poor waitress, was gone. In her place stood the daughter of Elias Vance, and she had just found her new purpose, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Her father hadn't just vanished, he had been erased, and she was going to write him back into existence. The termination was as swift as it was cold. Mr. Abernathy handed Alara a small cardboard box with the contents of her locker and her final paycheck. his face a stony mask of corporate loyalty. He made it clear that any attempt to contact anyone from the event or to set foot on Thorne property again would result in her arrest. The message was unmistakable. Marcus Thorne's reach was long, and his memory was longer. The late-night bus ride home was a surreal blur of rain-streaked windows and the hollow ache of despair. The sheer weight of her new reality was crushing. No job, a sick mother to support, and now a powerful, ruthless enemy who knew her name. How could she fight a man who owned the city? When she quietly let herself into their small, ground-floor apartment, the only sound was the gentle hum of her mother's oxygen concentrator from the bedroom. The sight of the woman sleeping, so fragile and dependent on her, sent a fresh wave of panic through Alara. What had she done? She had detonated their fragile life for a single moment of righteous fury. She sank onto the worn floral sofa, burying her head in her hands. The scene in the ballroom replayed in her mind. The shock on Thorne's face, the venom in his eyes, the name he had whispered under his breath. Project Ethel. It wasn't a delusion. It was real. A new thought cut through her despair like a searchlight. For 15 years, she had been armed with nothing but grief and a child's stubborn disbelief. Now she had a weapon, a name. Marcus Thorne. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline that shoved aside her exhaustion, Alara went to the back of the hall closet. Behind a row of winter coats was a small door, leading to a cramped, musty storage space under the stairs. It was where her mother had packed away the last remnants of her father, unable to look at them, but unwilling to throw them away. Under the dim glow of a single pull-chain bulb, she began to dig. She didn't know what she was looking for. A letter, a journal, anything to corroborate the truth she now felt in her bones. She sifted through boxes of old tax records and holiday decorations. Then she found it. A long, heavy-duty cardboard tube, the kind used for architectural drawings, labeled simply EV Concepts. Her heart hammered against her ribs. With trembling fingers, she pried off the plastic cap. Inside, rolled tightly together, were dozens of sketches and blueprints. She carefully unrolled them on the small living room floor. It was his work. Page after page of his distinctive, passionate style. There were designs for libraries, bridges, and small, impossible houses. And then she saw it, an early rendering of the Obsidian Tower. It was unmistakable, but it was titled the Ethel Tower. The notes in the margins, in her father's elegant script, were all there. Calculations for the cantilevered atrium, ideas for the sustainable energy core, sketches of the very spire that now defined the city's skyline. Deeper in the tube, she found a small, separate roll of papers held together by a brittle rubber band. It was a file of correspondence, letters between her father and a young, hungry Marcus Thorne. The early letters were filled with mutual excitement and a shared vision. They had been partners. Elias, one letter from Thorne read, "Your vision is going to change the world. I've secured the initial funding. We're going to build a monument to the future." But the tone of the later letters shifted. Thorne became more controlling, more dismissive of Elias's creative concerns, focusing only on budgets and timelines. The final document in the pile made her blood run cold. It was a carbon copy of a legal agreement, a partnership dissolution. It was dated just 1 week before her father disappeared. The document, dense with legalese, stated that Elias Vance was voluntarily relinquishing all claims and rights to their shared intellectual property, specifically a project codenamed Ethel, in exchange for a shockingly small buyout. The reason cited was Mr. Vance's ongoing mental and emotional instability and his inability to fulfill his professional obligations. The most damning part was the signature line at the bottom. It was her father's name, but the signature was a grotesque forgery. The elegant, sweeping E was cramped and awkward. The sharp, decisive V was hesitant and shaky. It was the clumsy scrawl of a man trying to imitate a master's hand. It looked nothing like the confident signature on the sketch Thorne had been parading around, and nothing like the thousands of authentic examples now spread across her floor. This was it, the smoking gun. Thorne hadn't just stolen an idea. he had orchestrated a meticulous corporate coup. He had manufactured a legal document to paper over his theft, painting his brilliant partner as unstable to discredit him and seize total control of their shared dream. A cold dread washed over her. The official story of her father's abandonment and suicide suddenly seemed far more sinister. A proud, brilliant man, about to be robbed of his life's work, his reputation systematically destroyed by the partner he trusted. Would he simply despair and walk away? Or would he fight back? And what would a man as ruthless as Marcus Thorne do to someone who stood in the way of a billion-dollar legacy? The thought was so horrifying it made her feel physically ill. Thorne hadn't just erased her father's name from a blueprint. He had erased the man himself. Ilara carefully gathered the forged document, the letters, and the original Ethel sketch. The dusty smell of the old paper no longer felt like a sad memory. It felt like gunpowder. For 15 years, she had been a victim of a story someone else had written. Now she had the evidence to write her own. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the blinds of the living room window, Ilara felt a profound shift within herself. The fear was still there, a cold, tight knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. She was no longer just fighting for a dead man's memory. She was fighting for his life. She had to prove he didn't sign that paper, that he didn't just run away. She had to find out what really happened 15 years ago. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she couldn't do it alone. The police would laugh her out of the station. The word of a fired waitress with a 15-year-old forged document against the city's most beloved philanthropist. She needed someone who already knew how to fight monsters like Marcus Thorne. Someone who wasn't afraid of him. She spent the next day at the public library, a place of quiet anonymity, using their computers to delve into Marcus Thorne's past. She searched for old articles, lawsuits, anything that hinted at a crack in his pristine public image. For a man of his stature, his record was suspiciously perfect. But as she dug deeper into archived newspaper sites from a decade ago, she found a name: Julian Croft. Julian Croft had been an investigative journalist for the City Tribune, a bulldog reporter known for his scathing exposés on corporate corruption. And 10 years ago, he had tried to sink his teeth into Marcus Thorne. He had published a series of articles questioning the official narrative of the Obsidian Tower's creation, citing anonymous sources who spoke of a ghost partner who had been cheated and forced out. The retaliation had been swift and brutal. Thorne's legal team sued Croft and the Tribune for defamation, launching a merciless smear campaign that painted Julian as a reckless, unethical muckraker. His sources, likely threatened or paid off, recanted their statements. The newspaper, facing a legal battle that would have bankrupted it, folded. They settled out of court, fired Julian Croft, and issued a full, groveling retraction of his articles. Julian's career was incinerated. He went from being a respected, feared journalist to a journalistic pariah overnight. Ilara found him through a small, independent podcast he now hosted from what sounded like his basement. It was a shadow of his former work, a cynical and rambling broadcast where he railed against the corporate and political powers that had crushed him. He was a wounded animal, still roaring, but from the confines of a cage. He was perfect. His address, which she found in an old public records database, was in a rundown part of the city, a neighborhood of brick walk-ups and cracked pavement. She knocked on the door of his second-floor apartment, the box of her father's documents held tight against her chest. The man who answered looked like a ghost himself. He was probably in his late 40s, but his eyes were ancient, etched with a deep, weary cynicism. His hair was a mess, his shirt was wrinkled, and the air that drifted out of his apartment smelled of stale coffee and obsession. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Are you Julian Croft?" He leaned against the doorframe, his expression a mix of irritation and boredom. "Used to be. Now I'm just a guy who talks into a microphone for an audience of 12. Who are you?" "My name is Ilara Vance," she said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "I think you were right about Marcus Thorne." His eyes narrowed. The boredom evaporated, replaced by a flash of something sharp and painful, like touching a hot stove. "That's ancient history, kid. I was wrong. The paper said so. The world said so. Now, if you'll excuse me, he started to close the door. Wait, Ilara said, putting her hand flat against the wood. You weren't wrong. You just didn't have the proof. He paused, studying her face. He saw not a conspiracy theorist or a starstruck fan, but a young woman with a desperate, burning sincerity in her eyes. With a sigh that sounded like it came from the depths of his soul, he opened the door wider. You've got 5 minutes. Then I'm calling the cops. His apartment was organized chaos. The walls were covered in corkboards, which were themselves covered in a spiderweb of newspaper clippings, photographs, and notes, all connected by a web of red yarn. It was the den of a man who had never let go of his obsession. And the center of it all, the biggest spider in the web, was a large, glossy photo of Marcus Thorne. You're still after him, Ilara said. It wasn't a question. Let's call it a hobby, Julian muttered, clearing a stack of books off a rickety chair. Like macrame, utterly pointless, but it keeps my hands busy. So what's your story? Did Thorne's new condo block your sunlight? Ilara ignored his bitter sarcasm. She walked over to his central corkboard and opened her box. First, she pulled out a faded photograph of her father and a much younger Marcus Thorne, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning in front of a sign that read, Vance Thorne Design. Julian's eyes widened slightly. Who's the other guy? He asked. My father, Elias Vance, Ilara said. Then she pinned the forged partnership dissolution agreement next to the photo. And this is the forgery Thorne used to steal my father's life's work. Look at the signature. Julian leaned in, the cynical journalist in him momentarily silenced by the instincts of the investigator. He peered at the clumsy signature, then looked back at Ilara. Last night, Ilara continued, her voice gaining strength, Marcus Thorne was at a gala at the Obsidian Tower. He was showing off the original concept sketch. It had my father's real signature on it. I confronted him. He had me fired on the spot. Julian was silent for a long moment, pacing the small, cluttered room. He picked up the photograph, studying the faces of the two young partners, so full of ambition and hope. He examined the forged document, his trained eye seeing the subtle signs of a fake, the inconsistent pressure, the hesitation in the strokes. He looked at the young woman standing in his apartment, who had just risked everything she had to speak the truth. Project Ethel, he whispered, looking at his own board where he had scrawled the name with a question mark next to it, a fragment from one of his sources who had later vanished. My father's name for it, Ilara confirmed. Julian finally looked at her, and for the first time, the cynical mask dropped. In its place was the ghost of the crusading reporter he had once been. The fire wasn't dead. It had just been smoldering, waiting for a spark. Kid, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Do you have any idea what you've just walked into? A man like Thorne doesn't build an empire like that and leave loose ends. If your father didn't sign that paper and then he conveniently disappears off the face of the earth? I know, Ilara said, her voice trembling for the first time. I don't think he just ran away. I don't think he's dead. I think Thorne did something to him. I think he's out there somewhere. Julian stared at her, then at his wall of obsession, at the complex web of power and lies he had been trying to untangle for a decade. He had been missing the key, the human element, the victim, the proof. And now she was standing in his living room. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a chance at redemption, his own, and Elias Vance's. Okay, Ilara Vance, he said, a slow, dangerous grin spreading across his face. You have my undivided attention. Let's go hunting. The alliance between the disgraced journalist and the determined daughter was forged in the quiet desperation of Julian's cluttered apartment. His space became their war room. Julian's chaotic energy, once aimless and bitter, now had a razor-sharp focus. He began working his old, neglected contacts, his interviewing skills reawakening from a long slumber. He pored over Ilara's evidence with a professional hunger he thought had died years ago. Ilara, in turn, became the heart of the investigation, meticulously cataloging her father's work, cross-referencing blueprints with Thorne's later projects, and painting a vivid picture of the brilliant, trusting artist Marcus Thorne had so thoroughly betrayed. Their first solid lead came from the name on the old sign in the photograph, Vance Thorne Design. Some deep diving into old business registries revealed that before they had formed their official partnership, they had worked out of a small, shared office space. A few more calls led them to the retired landlord of that building, a man named Sal. After some initial reluctance, Sal remembered the two young architects. Elias was the talent, Sal said over the phone, his voice crackling with age. A real artist. Thorn. He was the shark. All ambition and sharp teeth. There was another fellow who worked with them, a structural engineer. Quiet guy, name of Gene. Gene Kowalski. He left right after Elias disappeared. Said the whole thing felt wrong. Finding Gene Kowalski was their next challenge. He had moved out of state years ago. Julian, using a knack for finding people who didn't want to be found, tracked him to a small town in Oregon where he was working as a high school physics teacher. They pooled their money for 2 bus tickets. When they found him, Gene was a gentle, soft-spoken man in his late 60s, with kind eyes that held a deep, lingering sadness. At first he was terrified to speak with them, but when Alara showed him the photograph of her father, his composure broke. "I should have done something," he whispered, his hands trembling as he held the photo. "I was a coward." Over coffee in a small-town diner, Gene Kowalski finally unburdened himself of a guilt he had carried for 15 years. He confirmed that the Ethel project was entirely Elias's creation. Thorne's contribution was schmoozing investors and handling the contracts. As Elias perfected the revolutionary design, Thorne grew increasingly secretive and paranoid. Marcus started cutting Elias out of the investor meetings, Gene explained, his voice low. He was passing the work off as his own. He told me once, "Genius is useless without a good container." He saw your father's talent as something to be captured and sold. The day Elias disappeared was burned into Gene's memory. Marcus called a staff meeting. He held up a document, the same one you have, and said Elias had suffered a severe mental breakdown and had signed over his share of the company. He said Elias was a liability. "It was a lie," Gene said, his voice cracking. "Elias was under pressure, sure, but he wasn't breaking down. He was on the verge of solving the final structural problem." He was elated. "That afternoon I saw 2 men in dark suits. They weren't investors. They were heavy. They escorted Elias out of the office. He wasn't yelling, but he looked confused, betrayed. Marcus told us he was being taken to a private clinic to get some rest. We never saw him again." Ilara felt the air rush out of her lungs. "You saw them take him?" Gene nodded, his face etched with shame. "We were all scared. Marcus had just secured the final round of funding based on your father's latest breakthroughs. He told us that if word of Elias's instability got out, the investors would pull out and we'd all be ruined. He made us complicit. He gave us all generous severance packages when he dissolved the company and immediately started Thorne Consolidated. It was hush money. I took it, and I ran." Julian leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Gene, you said a private clinic. Did you ever hear a name? A location?" Gene hesitated, his eyes darting around the diner, as if Thorne himself could be listening from a nearby booth. "Marcus was on the phone earlier that day. I overheard him. He mentioned a place, a long-term care facility. He said it was for difficult cases, a place where wealthy families could discreetly house their embarrassing relatives. He called it Blackwood Manor." The name hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. A manor, not a hospital, a place for the forgotten. "Is it still there?" Ilara asked, her voice a whisper. Julian was already typing on his laptop, using the diner's spotty Wi-Fi. After several minutes of searching, his face grew grim. "It is. It's now called the Blackwood Wellness Center. It's an exclusive, high-security private facility deep in the mountains, a few hours from the city. Specializes in long-term psychiatric and memory care for a discerning clientele. The ownership is buried under 3 layers of shell corporations. But I'd bet my life Marcus Thorne is the one pulling the strings." Ilara stood up, a maelstrom of emotions swirling inside her. Rage, grief, and a terrifying fragile hope. Her father wasn't dead. He was a prisoner. For 15 years he had been locked away, silenced, while the man who stole his life built an empire on his stolen dreams. "We have to get him out," she said, her voice shaking with an iron resolve she didn't know she possessed. Gene looked at her, his sad eyes filled with a fearful admiration. Be careful, you two. The Marcus Thorne I knew was a hungry shark. The man he is now, he's a leviathan. He has spent 2 decades protecting that lie. He will do anything to keep it buried. The confirmation that her father was likely alive, a prisoner in a luxury asylum, transformed their quest. It was no longer about justice for the past, it was a rescue mission for the future. The stakes were no longer just reputation and money, they were life and freedom. Back in New York, Julian used his investigative skills to probe the Blackwood Wellness Center. What he found was a digital and physical fortress. It was located in a remote wooded valley, accessible by a single private road. The perimeter was protected by motion sensors, thermal cameras, and a private security force staffed by ex-military personnel. Gaining entry through official channels was impossible. They needed a court order, which they couldn't get without definitive proof that Elias was inside. And they couldn't get that proof without getting in. It was a perfect diabolical catch-22, designed by a man who left nothing to chance. As they strategized in Julian's apartment, the pressure from Thorne began. It was subtle at first. The lock on Elara's apartment door was tampered with. Julian's podcast was suddenly hit with a series of copyright strikes from anonymous accounts, getting it temporarily suspended. They were being warned. The intimidation escalated dramatically one evening when Elara returned home from buying groceries. Her small apartment had been professionally tossed. It wasn't a robbery. The small TV and her mother's jewelry were untouched. But the storage closet under the stairs had been ransacked. Her father's blueprints and documents were scattered, some of them missing. The message was chillingly clear. We know who you are. We know what you have. Stop now. Her mother, Laura, was terrified. Elara, please, she begged, her voice frail with fear. Whatever this is, it's not worth it. He's too powerful. I lost your father. I can't lose you, too. Looking at her mother's frightened face, Elara felt a pang of guilt, but it was swallowed by a defiant rage. This is exactly why we have to do it, Mom, she said, her voice low and fierce. They're scared. For the first time, they're the ones who are scared. We're getting close. The break-in galvanized them. They had to act, and they had to act now. Their only hope was an inside track. Julian spent 2 days making discreet calls to his few remaining contacts in the city planning department and construction unions. Finally, he got a hit, an old foreman who had worked on a renovation of Blackwood Manor a few years back. The place is a fortress now, the foreman told Julian over a beer in a noisy bar. But the old wing, the original asylum, it's built on a network of ancient steam tunnels. They used them to heat the place back in the day. Most are sealed off, but there's one maintenance access point outside the main perimeter, down by the old creek bed. It's probably been forgotten for 50 years. It was the crack in the armor they needed. The plan was audacious and terrifyingly dangerous. Julian would act as lookout and communications hub from a rental car parked on a nearby logging road. Elara, smaller and more agile, would be the one to go in. Gene Kowalski, after much soul-searching, had provided them with a hand-drawn layout of the old wing from memory. He knew which rooms were used for the permanent residents. She would have a small earpiece to communicate with Julian and a burner phone to photograph any evidence. The night they chose was dark and moonless, with a thick fog rolling through the mountain valley, providing an extra layer of cover. The drive to the remote facility was silent, the air in the car thick with unspoken fear. You don't have to do this, Elara, Julian said softly, his eyes on the winding road. We can find another way. Is there another way, Julian? She replied, her gaze fixed on the imposing silhouette of the facility that was beginning to emerge through the trees. He's been in there for 15 years. Every day we wait is another day they take from him. I'm going in. They parked on a dirt trail, hidden from the main road. Julian set up his equipment, a laptop linked to a signal booster and a police scanner. Comms check, he said, his voice all business. I hear you, Elara whispered into the tiny mic clipped to her collar. You have a 20-minute window, Max. After that, the night patrol sweeps the west perimeter. Get in, find him, get a picture, and get out. Do not get caught. Your life is the priority. We can't help him if you're in there with him. Elara nodded, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pulled on a small backpack containing a powerful flashlight, a pry bar, and the phone. "See you in 20 minutes," she said, managing a small, tight smile. Then she slipped out of the car and melted into the foggy, silent woods, a daughter moving toward the prison that held her father. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. The air was cold and damp. She was terrified, but a single, powerful thought propelled her forward. "Dad, I'm coming." The crawl through the steam tunnel was a journey into the Earth's cold, damp belly. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay. After what felt like an eternity of wriggling through the narrow, claustrophobic space, she found a vertical maintenance ladder. It led to a grated trapdoor. Using the pry bar, she managed to force it open, gritting her teeth against the screech of rusted metal. She hoisted herself up into the silent, cavernous basement of Blackwood Manor. The service tunnels were a labyrinth of pipes, dimly lit by caged emergency lights. A low, constant hum vibrated through the concrete floor. "I'm in," she whispered into her mic. "Copy that," Julian's voice crackled in her ear, a lifeline to the outside world. "According to Jean's map, you need to find the old staff staircase. It's at the north end of the basement. It will take you to the ground floor of the secure residential wing. Be quiet. They have orderlies on patrol." Navigating by the faded stencils on the walls, Alara found the staircase. She ascended cautiously, every sense screaming with alertness. The air grew warmer, the smell of disinfectant stronger. She emerged into a hallway that was a world away from the grimy basement. Here, everything was sterile, plush, and eerily silent. The floors were carpeted, the walls were adorned with bland, soothing art, and soft lighting gave the corridor a serene, dreamlike quality. It was a beautiful, silent prison. The doors were heavy wood, identified only by numbers. Each had a small, reinforced window. "I'm in the secure wing," she breathed. "It's quiet, too quiet." "That's the idea," Julian said. "Patients here are kept isolated and managed. Jean said your father would be in one of the corner rooms. More private. Start checking. You have 15 minutes left." Heart pounding, Alara began her grim task, moving like a ghost from door to door, peering through the small windows. In the first room, a woman sat staring at a wall. In the next, a man was sleeping, his face slack and empty. Each room held a person who had been erased from the world, their fortunes paying for their own oblivion. Then she reached room 101, a corner room at the end of the hall. She peered through the glass, and her world stopped. The room was Spartan. A bed, a table, a chair. Sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to her, was a man with thinning gray hair. He was gaunt, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. He was sketching in a small notebook, his movements slow and methodical. Then he turned his head slightly to look out the barred window, and Alara saw his profile in the dim light. The face was older, thinner, etched with lines of a sorrow she couldn't comprehend. But it was him. The high forehead, the aquiline nose, the intensity in his brow. Even in this sedated state, it was her father. A sob escaped her throat, and she clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle it. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. He was alive. After 15 years of mourning him, of carrying his ghost with her every day, he was here. "Julian," she whispered, her voice choked with a tsunami of emotions. "I found him. It's him." "Okay, Alara. Okay." Julian's voice was a steady anchor in her storm. "Get the picture. We need proof. Get the picture and get out." With hands that shook so badly she could barely hold the phone, she raised it to the glass. She had to get his face. She tapped lightly on the reinforced window. "Dad." The sound was almost inaudible, but in the profound silence of the hall, it was enough. Elias Vance flinched. He turned slowly, his eyes clouded and distant, as if he were looking at her through a thick fog. There was a flicker of confusion, a ghost of recognition, but it was buried under a mountain of medication and a decade and a half of isolation. "Dad, it's me," she whispered, pressing her hand against the cold glass. "It's Alara." His brow furrowed. The name seemed to stir something deep inside him. He took a hesitant step toward the door, his eyes trying to pierce the veil of his consciousness. It was in that moment, as he looked toward her, his face a heartbreaking canvas of confusion and longing, that she got the picture. A clear, well-lit shot of his face. The proof. Suddenly, a heavy clank echoed from the far end of the hallway, an electronic lock, an orderly beginning his rounds. "Ilara, you have to go. Now!" Julian's voice was sharp with urgency. Panic seized her. She couldn't leave him. Not again. But she knew if she were caught, they would both be lost forever. The proof on her phone would be erased, and she would be buried in this place with him. "I love you, Dad," she whispered through the glass. "I'm coming back for you, I promise." She didn't know if he heard or understood, but as she turned to flee, she saw him raise his hand and press it against the glass. A mirror of her own gesture. Adrenaline dumped into her system. She sprinted back the way she came, her footsteps swallowed by the thick carpet. She scrambled down the maintenance stairs, her lungs burning, and plunged back into the dark labyrinth of the basement. She found the steam tunnel trap door, hoisted herself in, and crawled frantically back toward the free world. The image of her father's haunted face burned into her mind. When she finally tumbled out of the access hatch back into the foggy, cold woods, she was gasping for air, covered in grime and tears. She ran, stumbling through the undergrowth until she saw the faint outline of Julian's car. She wrenched the door open and collapsed into the passenger seat, shaking uncontrollably. "I have it," she gasped, holding up the phone as if it were a holy relic. "I have the proof." Julian didn't speak. He just put a steadying hand on her shoulder as she sobbed. For the father she had lost, for the father she had found, and for the war that was about to begin. They had breached the fortress. Now it was time to bring it down. The photograph was everything. It was grainy, taken through thick, reinforced glass. But the man in the picture was undeniably Elias Vance. Julian Croft, holding the burner phone in his hand, knew this was the key. This image, combined with Gene Kowalski's sworn testimony and the forged partnership document, was more than just a story. It was a bombshell. He worked for the next 48 hours straight, fueled by black coffee and the resurrected spirit of the journalist he used to be. Ilara sat with him, providing details, memories, and the raw human emotion that would make the story resonate. Julian didn't just write an article. He crafted a legal indictment, a masterpiece of investigative journalism that laid out the entire sordid saga. He detailed the hopeful partnership, the cold-blooded betrayal, the forged documents, the kidnapping disguised as a medical intervention, and the 15 years of illegal, secret imprisonment. He embedded Ilara's photograph. He included excerpts from Gene's notarized affidavit. He commissioned a forensic handwriting expert to analyze Robert's real signature against the forgery, including the expert's damning conclusion. He named Marcus Thorne not as a shrewd businessman, but as a kidnapper and a monster. He didn't publish it on his small podcast. This was too big for the fringe. He called in the single most important favor he had left in the world. A late-night call to the executive editor of the New York Chronicle, one of the few people who had privately expressed their belief in him a decade ago. He sent the encrypted file with a two-word message. "Print it." The story broke on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't a ripple, it was a global tsunami. Whereas Elias Vance became the #1 trending topic worldwide within an hour. The stock for Thorne Consolidated, Marcus Thorne's parent company, flatlined in pre-market trading, wiping out billions of dollars in value before the opening bell even rang. News vans descended like vultures on Thorne's gleaming corporate headquarters and swarmed the gates of the Blackwood Wellness Center. Marcus Thorne was ambushed. He issued a furious, blustering denial, calling the story a vicious and baseless fabrication orchestrated by a disgraced, vengeful reporter and a delusional young woman. But the evidence was too powerful. The photograph of a haunted Elias Vance was on every news channel, next to the picture of the vibrant, smiling architect he had been. The narrative was too detailed and too damning. The wall of lies Thorne had meticulously constructed over 2 decades crumbled to dust in a matter of hours. That afternoon, armed with a federal warrant issued on the strength of Julian's reporting, the FBI raided the Blackwood Wellness Center. They found Elias Vance in room 101, just as Ilara had described. He was disoriented and physically weak, his mind clouded by years of inappropriate medication. But the brilliant spark was still there, buried deep inside. When a female agent gently asked his name, he looked at her, and with a clarity that shocked everyone, he said, "My name is Elias Vance, and I want to see my daughter." The reunion was not in a sterile hospital room, but in a private, secure wing of a real clinic. When Alara walked in, her father was sitting up in bed, free of the sedatives that had been his companions for a decade and a half. He looked at her, and this time, there was no fog in his eyes. There was only recognition and a profound, overwhelming love that had survived 15 years of silence. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "You came back." She rushed to his side and they clung to each other. 15 years of stolen time and silent grief melting away in a single powerful embrace. Her mother, Laura, was there too, holding her husband's hand, her own illness seeming to recede in the face of this impossible miracle. Marcus Thorne's downfall was as swift as it was absolute. He was arrested that evening, his private jet grounded on the tarmac as he attempted to flee the country. The legal battle was monumental, but the evidence was insurmountable. Gene Kowalski's testimony, the facility's illegally doctored medical records, and the labyrinthine financial trail that led from Thorne's personal accounts directly to Blackwood's shell corporations sealed his fate. He was convicted of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and a dozen counts of corporate fraud. The empire built on a lie was systematically dismantled, but from the ashes of Thorne Consolidated, something new began to grow. The original patents and designs for Project Ethel, now rightfully returned to Elias Vance, became the foundation for a new firm, Vance and Croft Architecture. Julian Croft, his reputation not just restored but made legendary, took a place on the board, vowing to ensure the company operated with the ironclad ethics he had fought for his entire life. And at the helm, as the firm's new president, was Alara Vance. She had traded her waitress apron for a tailored suit, but she had lost none of the fire and resolve that had led her there. She was no longer just the daughter of a genius. She was a force in her own right, her brilliant mind, once forced into dormancy, now dedicated to building a better, more honest future with the designs her father had dreamed up so long ago. Months later, Alara stood with her father and Julian in a bright, sunlit design studio, looking at a new interactive 3D model on a large screen. Her father, though still frail, had the old light back in his eyes. "The cantilever," Elias said, pointing a slightly trembling finger at the screen. "I finally figured out the stabilization matrix. It took me 15 years of thinking in that room, with nothing but a pencil and my own mind, but I solved it." Alara smiled, a real, brilliant smile that lit up her entire face. "I know you did, Dad," she said, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Let's go build it. For real this time."